You fired me in front of everyone, for a necklace you misplaced. Grace's voice was calm. Across the table, Eleanor's face turned pale. She had come to pitch for funding. She didn't expect the chairman's wife to be the maid she once destroyed. What she did will shock you. Before we continue, like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now let's begin. The engagement party was held at the Carrington estate, a mansion so grand it looked like it had never heard the word modesty. Champagne flowed like water, string quartets played beneath chandeliers, and every guest whispered about Eleanor. She was radiant, a vision in silver satin, her diamond engagement ring catching the light with every wave of her hand. She smiled, posed, charmed, the perfect hostess. At her side stood Martin Carrington, heir to the Carrington Group, a well-dressed man whose silence often passed for strength. He rarely spoke more than needed, but everyone respected his wealth and feared his mother. Yet tonight, all eyes were on Eleanor. She's going to change the face of this family, one guest murmured. A real power couple. But beneath the elegance, Eleanor wore her pride like perfume, invisible but potent. She measured worth in brands, backgrounds, and beauty. And when she looked at the staff who served her champagne or adjusted her heels, it wasn't with gratitude. It was with quiet contempt. One of those staff members was Grace, the housemaid. Young, soft-spoken, and graceful in her movements. Grace had worked for the Carrington family for over 3 years. She never missed a day, never raised her voice, and never made herself seen more than necessary. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, attending to Eleanor's endless requests with a quiet, "Yes, ma'am," every time. But tonight, something shifted. Eleanor had begun noticing things she didn't like. How Martin said thank you to Grace too often. How she smiled when Grace refilled his drink. Nothing obvious. Just enough to stir the storm brewing behind Eleanor's carefully done lashes. And storms like that? They never passed quietly. The morning after the engagement party, the Carrington estate was unusually quiet. The kind of hush that follows a storm of laughter, music, and too much wine. But for the staff, the day began early, just like any other. Grace was already up, hair tied neatly, uniform pressed, moving with practiced rhythm through the kitchen. She always started with tea for Mrs. Carrington, then fresh flowers for the foyer. She knew which curtains to draw back depending on the hour and which of Martin's shirts needed to be steamed for meetings. To the rest of the staff, she wasn't just reliable, she was family. "She helped my son with his school applications," the butler once whispered. "She covered my shift when my husband was in the hospital," said another maid. Grace was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, shared her lunch, and knew when to listen without judgment. But to Eleanor, she was invisible. Whenever Eleanor entered a room, Grace was just part of the furniture, there to serve, not to be acknowledged. Even when Grace greeted her with a gentle smile or held open a door, Eleanor rarely looked her in the eye. "She's always lingering," Eleanor once complained to Martin. "Too comfortable for a maid." Martin had shrugged. "She's just doing her job." Eleanor had pressed her lips together. "She's doing more than that. Watch her." Grace noticed the shift, the narrowed glances, the clipped tone, the way Eleanor began triple-checking everything she touched. But she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the only shield someone in her position could carry. Still, she carried it with grace. What Grace didn't know was that Eleanor's silence wasn't rooted in caution. It was rooted in calculation. And Eleanor was waiting, for the smallest misstep, to strike. It happened 3 days after the engagement party. Eleanor's voice pierced through the estate like a siren. "It's gone. My necklace is gone." Within minutes, the household staff had gathered outside her room, nervous and confused. The necklace in question, a diamond-studded sapphire gifted by Martin's mother, had been stored in a black velvet box inside Eleanor's private drawer. And now it was missing. "I left it right here," she snapped, eyes blazing. "Last night. I wore it to dinner and placed it in this drawer myself." Martin stood beside her, expression tense. "Are you sure it wasn't moved?" "Do I look unsure?" she hissed. Then her eyes darted sharply toward the doorway, where Grace stood silently, hands clasped, eyes wide. "She was the one who brought in the laundry this morning," Eleanor said slowly, venomously. "She had access to this room." Grace took a step forward, voice shaking. "Ma'am, I didn't even touch your drawers. I folded the sheets and left." But Eleanor's eyes were already narrowed, her tone icy. Of course you'd say that. Martin raised a hand. Let's not jump to conclusions. No, Eleanor snapped. I won't be made to look like a fool in my own home. This isn't the first time I've felt watched. She's always hovering. Grace's throat tightened. I would never steal. You can search my things. We will, Eleanor said coldly. But even if we find nothing, trust is broken. Martin hesitated, then looked away. It's best she leaves. We can't have this kind of suspicion in the house. The words cut deeper than a blade. Grace looked at him. The man she had served tea, ironed shirts for, defended to other staff. There was no warmth in his eyes now. Only discomfort. No police. No evidence. Just whispers and a missing necklace. By sundown, Grace was gone. She walked out through the servants' entrance, carrying nothing but her folded uniform and her pride, bruised but intact. And behind her, the mansion returned to silence. The gate shut behind her with a slow, metallic groan. Grace stood just outside the Carrington estate, holding a small worn-out bag that carried everything she owned. A few clothes, her ID, and a pair of flat shoes wrapped in an old kitchen towel. She didn't cry. Not then. The tears had already dried on the inside, buried beneath shock and shame. There was no severance. No thank you. Not even a final glass of water. Only silence. The same guards who once greeted her each morning now avoided her gaze. The head housekeeper, who had known Grace since her first day, had quietly turned away when she was escorted out. The message was clear. Protect your own survival. Eleanor had made sure no one dared question her accusation. Grace walked down the long driveway, head held high despite the weight pressing down on her chest. Her heart thudded with every step, not from guilt, but from betrayal. 3 years of loyal service erased in a single breath. She replayed it all in her mind. The look in Eleanor's eyes, cold, sharp, almost eager. The way Martin didn't even ask to hear her side properly. It's best she leaves, he had said. As if she were a bad smell, not a human being. Grace reached the bus stop and sat on a wooden bench that creaked beneath her. She pulled her jacket tighter against the breeze and stared into the distance. Where was she supposed to go? She had no family in the city. No savings to fall back on. No reference letter. Just a whisper of scandal now clinging to her name. But even in that moment, sitting alone, discarded, and humiliated, something inside her refused to break. Not out of pride. Out of principle. She had done nothing wrong. And if the world didn't see her worth right now, she would find a way to make them see it later. She reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook she always carried. Pages filled with dreams she used to write during quiet evenings in the servant quarters. Business ideas. Goals. Names of organizations that supported women starting over. She tore out a blank sheet and wrote one line. Let the fall be the reason you fly. Then she stood and walked into her unknown, with nothing but dignity and determination in her pocket. Grace's new life didn't begin with a miracle. It began with a mop. She found work at a local cleaning agency, scrubbing office floors after hours and wiping down restaurant kitchens before sunrise. It paid just enough to cover rent for a tiny studio apartment where the walls were thin and the tap leaked every other night. But she never missed a shift, never came late, and never let anyone see how tired she was. During the day, when her schedule allowed, she visited the public library. The city had a community program that offered free computer access and discounted evening classes in entrepreneurship and digital literacy. Grace enrolled immediately. She sat through every session, taking notes with the same care she once gave to folding sheets at the Carrington estate. While others scrolled on their phones during breaks, Grace researched business models, watched online tutorials, and taught herself how to draft proposals. It didn't matter that she had no degree. Her hunger to grow burned brighter than any title ever could. One night, while reviewing budgeting principles in her class, she overheard 2 women discussing a local nonprofit. They help women restart their lives, one said, especially those who've been dismissed, accused, or forgotten. The words struck something deep. Grace followed the lead. She found the organization, the Phoenix Foundation, and walked in one rainy afternoon with nothing but her story and the will to give back. She didn't go there to ask for help. She went to offer it. Soon, she became one of their most committed volunteers, organizing workshops for survivors of workplace abuse, mentoring younger women who had lost confidence, and sharing her own quiet truth. They tried to break me with shame. but I decided shame wouldn't be my ending. The work filled her in a way no paycheck ever had. People started to notice her, not because of her past, but because of her presence. Grace still wore simple clothes, still moved quietly, but now, her silence wasn't submission. It was strength. She was no longer the maid in the background. She was a woman rebuilding herself, not with vengeance, but with vision. And without knowing it, she was already walking into the future that would rewrite everything. It was a Thursday morning, just after a women's mentorship session at the Phoenix Foundation. Grace was helping pack away chairs when a voice behind her said, "That was powerful. You have a gift with people." She turned to see a man in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp navy blue shirt and rolled up sleeves. His face was kind, his smile warm but not forced, the kind that didn't need to be convincing because it was genuine. "Thank you," Grace said politely. "Sorry, have we met?" "Not yet," he replied. "I'm Richard Lawson. I'm on the board of this foundation, but I'm rarely in town. I came to sit in on today's session." Grace nodded, brushing her hands against her jeans. "I'm Grace. I just help out where I can." "Well, you do it remarkably," he said. "I've attended these for years, and I don't think I've seen a group of women walk out with as much hope as they did today." She offered a small smile. Hope is the first thing most of them had taken from them. "I guess I just try to give back what I once lost." Richard didn't pry. He simply said, "That's a noble way to live." From that moment, their paths began to cross more often, sometimes in meetings, sometimes during events. He would ask how her classes were going. She would ask about his travels. And slowly, cautiously, the space between them began to close. It wasn't romantic at first. It was respect. And then, somewhere between coffee shop conversations and shared laughter over mismatched meeting schedules, that respect turned into something deeper. Grace didn't know much about Richard beyond what others said in hushed tones, that he was old money, well-connected, and known for walking away from deals that lacked integrity. He never flaunted wealth, never acted superior. One evening, as they walked out of a networking dinner, Richard turned to her and said, "You know, for someone who calls herself ordinary, you carry yourself like someone who's survived 100 storms." Grace laughed softly. "I guess I have." He looked at her for a moment and said, "Well, I'd be honored to stand beside someone like that." It was the gentlest confession she'd ever received. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't punishing her anymore. Maybe it was preparing her. Grace had once believed that love only bloomed in grand gestures. Roses on birthdays, diamonds in velvet boxes, candlelit declarations under starlit skies. But with Richard, it came in simpler forms. He never interrupted her when she spoke. He brought her books on business strategy without being asked. And on nights when she doubted herself, he'd say, "Build it scared. Just don't stop building." Their love grew quietly, like ivy, strong, steady, and impossible to ignore. Richard never pressured her to open up about her past. He knew there were shadows, but he didn't chase them. Instead, he lit every room she stepped into, until the darkness no longer felt so threatening. One evening, as they sat at a small cafe overlooking the city skyline, he asked, "If you could start anything, business-wise, what would it be?" Grace stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Something that helps women like me. The ones who had to start from nothing with no one backing them. A retail brand that trains, employs, and shares profits with women rebuilding their lives." Richard smiled. "That's not just a good idea. That's purpose." From that day forward, he became her silent partner, not in ownership, but in belief. He connected her to a friend who ran a co-working space, introduced her to an ethical fabric supplier, helped her build a pitch deck, then insisted she presented herself at a small business summit. Grace named her Venture Threaded Grace, a clothing and accessories brand handcrafted by women from shelters, halfway homes, and community programs. Every item came with a tag signed by the woman who made it. The idea caught fire. Orders trickled in through word of mouth. Then a local fashion blogger wrote about her mission. Sales surged. News outlets called it fashion with a heart and a spine. But to Grace, it wasn't just business. It was redemption in motion. She hired her first seamstress, then 3 more. Eventually, she secured a small studio space in the city. Every stitch sewn, every product shipped, was proof that the label of maid had never defined her. She was an entrepreneur now. But more than that, She was a woman no longer living in the shadow of what was done to her. She was standing in the light of what she had built. The proposal wasn't extravagant. There was no crowd hiding in bushes or flash mobs in the park. No perfectly staged photos or glittering skyline behind them. It was just the two of them, on a quiet Sunday morning, sitting barefoot on the kitchen floor, eating pancakes off paper plates because Grace's oven had short-circuited again. Richard reached into his jacket, casually draped over a chair, and pulled out a small, velvet box. Grace stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or panic. He opened it slowly. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, a single diamond flanked by two tiny sapphires. "I didn't plan a speech," he said gently. "Because with you, things haven't needed big performances. Just honesty." She looked at him, wide-eyed, heart-thumping. "I know what you've come through," Richard continued. "I know what you've built. And I know that wherever you go from here, I want to walk beside you." He paused. No pressure. No expectations. Just this question, will you marry me? Grace didn't answer immediately. Her fingers brushed the edge of the box, but her mind had already traveled. Back to the night she walked out of the Carrington estate, alone and accused. Back to the days of scrubbing floors just to stay afloat. Back to the shame that clung to her, even when she smiled. Could she really say yes? Did she belong in a life this peaceful? She stood, turned away for a moment, her back to him. Richard didn't move. He didn't repeat himself. He just waited. And in that silence, she realized something. He wasn't asking her to forget her past. He was offering her a future that included it, without judgment. She turned around, eyes damp but certain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, but only if we keep eating pancakes on the floor sometimes." Richard grinned, stood up, and slipped the ring onto her finger. Deal. They didn't celebrate with champagne or violin music. They just sat there, side by side, sharing syrup and soft smiles. Two people who had found each other not through perfection, but through persistence. And as sunlight streamed through the window, Grace looked at her hand. Not because of the diamond, but because of how far that hand had reached. From disgrace to this, the wedding was intimate. No press, no influencers, no social climbing guests. Just 30 close friends, a string quartet, and an open garden filled with yellow tulips, Grace's favorite. She wore a soft ivory gown with no designer label. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, her smile effortless. Richard waited at the altar beneath a flowered arch, watching her walk down the aisle, as if he couldn't believe she was real. When they exchanged vows, there were no rehearsed poems or tearful theatrics. Only truth. "I thought love was something you had to earn," Grace said, her voice steady. "But you showed me it's something you're safe in." Richard smiled. "And you showed me that grace isn't just your name, it's how you live." The guests clapped. There wasn't a dry eye in sight. But what most of them didn't know, and what Grace herself had only fully grasped weeks earlier, was who exactly Richard was. Not just a kind man with a good heart. Not just a board member at a nonprofit. Richard Lawson was the chairman of LPI Holdings, one of the most powerful private investment firms in the country. A company that backed major tech, fashion, and real estate ventures. A firm with enough influence to make or break a startup with a single nod. Grace had found out by accident. She had been speaking to an event organizer about a potential partnership for Threaded Grace. When the organizer heard her last name, she raised an eyebrow. "Wait, Lawson? As in Richard Lawson?" Grace had nodded. "The chairman of LPI?" Grace had blinked. "I didn't realize he was the chairman." Richard later confirmed it with his usual humility. "I didn't hide it. I just didn't lead with it. Titles don't matter to me, people do." And that was why it never changed how he treated her. To him, she had always been more than where she came from. And now, she was more than a wife. She was a partner. In life, in purpose, and soon, in decisions that would impact the dreams of others. As they slow danced under a canopy of fairy lights that night, Grace leaned into him and whispered, "I still feel like the girl folding sheets in someone else's house." Richard kissed her forehead. "You were never meant to serve," he said. "You were meant to lead." And soon, the world would learn just how true that was. Eleanor paced her apartment in silence, barefoot, wearing a silk robe that still whispered of old money, even though the life it once represented had long vanished. The marble floors and gold accents were still there, but the energy had shifted. What once felt luxurious now felt cold, borrowed, and fading. Martin's business had collapsed a year after their wedding. A string of bad investments, a failed merger, and a scandal involving misappropriated funds had gutted his image. The headlines had been brutal. Carrington's house of cards crumbles. Once a titan, now a liability. And through it all, Eleanor had clung to image. Designer clothes. Forced smiles. Public charity events she could no longer afford to sponsor. But now, the credit cards were maxed. The drivers and stylists were gone. Even Martin had retreated into silence. Brooding, distant, no longer the man who once swept her into rooms with champagne and applause. She stood in the mirror, staring at herself. "You're not done," she said aloud. "You're still Eleanor Blake Carrington." And then, like a woman drowning who suddenly sees a distant rope, she decided to reinvent. A tech startup. That's what the world wanted now. It didn't matter that she knew little about code or UX design. What mattered was the story, the pitch. She could build a brand around empowering women through digital connection. A sleek app, elegant branding, a website that promised change. She called it Shivo, short for She Evolves. The concept was vague, but it sounded smart enough to catch attention. A networking and resource-sharing platform for ambitious women. Mostly recycled ideas from apps that already existed, but with her name and her voice, she believed she could sell it. She started recording practice pitches, wearing soft beige suits in front of her iPhone camera. Her voice was still polished, confident. The old charm was still there, even if the light in her eyes flickered. She applied to every investment forum she could find, tailoring her story to fit each one. After a painful fall from the peak, I realized I wanted to build something that mattered. Shivo is my second chapter, and it's designed to give other women the power to write theirs. She embellished her business background, citing years of brand strategy and insight into high-level executive decision-making. Never mind that most of it came from watching Martin's calls on speakerphone. Weeks passed. Then, the email arrived. "You've been shortlisted for the LPI Business Forum, where the region's most promising startups pitch directly to our board of investors." Eleanor gasped, hand over her mouth. LPI Holdings. She had heard of them. Everyone in business had. If you got funding there, doors didn't open, they fell off the hinges. Her hands trembled slightly as she reread the email. Finally, a second chance. A return to relevance. She didn't know who the board members were. She didn't care. All that mattered was her foot was back in the door, and this time, she would make sure it stayed there. What she didn't realize was that behind that door sat the very woman she once destroyed. And this time, Grace had the power to decide her fate. Eleanor arrived at the Grand Elm Business Center 30 minutes early, clutching her leather-bound pitch folder like it held her future, because it did. The building towered above her, modern and merciless, its glass walls reflecting a woman trying to hold herself together. She wore a crisp white suit, heels sharp enough to intimidate, and makeup that screamed perfection. But beneath the surface, her nerves fluttered like trapped birds. This was the LPI Business Investment Forum, one of the most exclusive pitch platforms in the country. Only 10 startups were invited. Only one would be selected for funding. For Eleanor, it wasn't just a pitch. It was survival. She stepped into the lobby, checked in, and received her badge. A sleek black tag with her name and startup in gold print. Eleanor Carrington, founder, Shivo. As she entered the elevator with a group of other hopefuls, she forced a polite smile. Some of them carried laptops. Others recited rehearsed lines under their breath. Eleanor said nothing. She had practiced in front of her mirror until her voice felt like armor. They were ushered into a sleek conference hall lined with frosted windows and soft lighting. At the far end sat a long table, 7 board members seated in polished black chairs. In the center, a spaced present. Eleanor recognized none of them. Perfect, she thought. No past to worry about. The host, a poised woman in a navy blue dress, welcomed the presenters and explained the format. 5 minutes to pitch, 10 minutes for questions, then silence, until the board released their verdicts. One by one, founders went up. Ideas ranged from AI-backed wellness trackers to sustainable packaging solutions. The panel was professional, quiet, observant, taking notes, but offering no cues. Then her name was called. Eleanor walked to the front, heart pounding beneath her designer suit. She took a steadying breath and began. Good afternoon. My name is Eleanor Carrington, and I'm here to present Shivo, a platform designed by women for for women, to help them rise from setbacks and redefine their success stories. She moved through her slides with practiced grace, stats, potential market size, monetization strategies. Her voice was confident, her posture perfect. But as she spoke, she noticed a shift. The room had gone still, too still. Her eyes scanned the board members. That's when she saw her. Seated at the center of the table beside the chairman, wearing a soft blue blouse and an unreadable expression, was Grace. No name tag, no title, just her. Their eyes locked. Eleanor's voice faltered for the first time. She blinked, lost her place in the slides, and scrambled to recover. Her hand trembled as she clicked to the next point. Grace didn't flinch. She simply watched, calm, composed, devastatingly silent. Eleanor's words stumbled forward, weaker now. Her mouth was moving, but her mind was somewhere else. Back in that mansion. Back in the room where she had accused this woman. Back to the moment Grace begged for dignity and was denied it. And now here she was, seated beside the man at the top. No longer in uniform. No longer beneath her, but above her. Eleanor tried to hold herself together as she clicked through the final slide. Her voice was still speaking, but her mind had fully detached, suspended in disbelief. Grace was really here. Not dressed in the muted uniform of a maid. Not holding a tray or blending into the background. No, Grace now sat beside the chairman, back straight, head high, in tailored elegance. No jewelry, no fanfare, just quiet power. And beside her sat Richard Lawson. Eleanor hadn't connected the dots when she first heard the chairman's name. She had skimmed the pre-event material, too focused on her pitch to notice the surname, Lawson. Now it all made sense. Richard Lawson, chairman of LPI Holdings. The man every startup dreamt of impressing. The man who, apparently, had married the maid she once accused and discarded like dust on marble. Eleanor's throat tightened as she delivered her closing line. With the right funding, Shivo can reshape the landscape for women ready to rise from failure and find purpose again. There was a soft pause, the kind that usually welcomed polite applause. But the board remained still. Richard leaned forward slightly, thanking her for the presentation. We'll deliberate and get back to you with our decision shortly. His tone was neutral, professional, not cold, but unreadable. Grace said nothing. She simply gave a polite nod. Eleanor nodded back, stiffly, then stepped away from the presentation space, retreating to the seating area at the side of the room. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat, heart racing, face flushed beneath her carefully applied foundation. Other presenters whispered politely among themselves. Some watched the board. But Eleanor, she only watched Grace. Her mind was spinning. How? How did she end up here? Who gave her a seat at this table? But the question that unsettled her the most was, what if she had never accused her? What if she had simply shown a little kindness, a little humility? She had built an entire brand around empowering women to rise from setbacks. And now she sat in front of the very woman she'd shoved into one. The irony wasn't poetic. It was devastating. The deliberation began. The board leaned in, whispering, reviewing notes, discussing each presenter. But Grace remained still for a moment, eyes scanning the list, then finally looking back up at Eleanor. This time, Eleanor didn't look away. She held Grace's gaze, not in challenge, but in quiet shame. She expected bitterness, a smirk, even subtle satisfaction. But Grace simply looked back with something far more terrifying. Calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from vengeance, but from victory that no longer needs to speak. Eleanor was called back into the boardroom for her final review. She rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. The sleek confidence that usually clung to her like perfume had evaporated. All that remained was the echo of a moment she hadn't prepared for, facing her. Grace. The woman she had once fired in front of an entire household staff without evidence or apology, now sat across from her, silent and still, like a verdict wrapped in elegance. Eleanor approached the center again, heart pounding louder than her heels on the polished floor. Ms. Carrington, Richard said, clasping his hands. Before we discuss next steps, we'd like to give you an opportunity to elaborate. Your concept for Shivo is promising, but we'd like to hear more about the core motivation behind it. Eleanor opened her mouth, and nothing came out. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. Of course, she began. The motivation is to help women rise after being overlooked or underestimated. To give them tools and... Her voice wavered. She glanced at Grace, seated beside Richard, not glaring, not gloating, just watching. Quietly. That look unraveled everything. Eleanor's confidence crumbled beneath the weight of memory. Grace standing at the doorway, defending herself. Martin nodding without hesitation. Eleanor holding that missing necklace as if it were proof of character, when all it proved was privilege. She fumbled with her notepad. The bullet points blurred. I believe in giving women a voice, she stammered, especially when no one listens. She paused. The words echoed with unintended irony. Grace tilted her head slightly, not in mockery, but as if asking, "Do you hear yourself now?" Eleanor swallowed hard, the silence stretching. She looked at Richard, then back at Grace, and for a moment, she forgot the investors, the pitch, the opportunity. All she saw was a woman she had once tried to erase, who had not only returned, but returned higher. "I apologize," Eleanor said softly. I wasn't expecting." She stopped herself, because excuses weren't what this room required. It required truth, and she had never learned how to speak it without first controlling the room. She lowered her gaze. Grace remained still. She hadn't spoken a word, but she didn't need to. The doors closed behind Eleanor. She returned to the waiting area, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, unsure if she had just pitched a business or buried a chance. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was still. Richard leaned forward and glanced down at the dossier in front of him. "Well," he began, "ST0L shows potential in concept, though the model lacks clarity. The branding is strong, but the business foundation seems unstable." Another board member nodded. "There's also a concern around authenticity. The founder has a good pitch, but it feels performative." Grace said nothing. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight. She hadn't spoken through any of the prior reviews, just listened, observed, absorbed. Now, Richard turned to her gently. "Grace, you've been quiet." The room shifted. The board members leaned in. They respected her, not just because of who she was married to, but because of who she had become. Calm, insightful, just. Grace met their eyes, then spoke, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with truth. "I know Eleanor Carrington personally," she said evenly. "Not as a founder, as a former employer." A murmur moved across the room. "She once accused me of stealing a necklace." No evidence. No investigation. Just a room full of eyes, and a judgment passed. Richard said nothing. He already knew the story, but this was the first time she had spoken it aloud in a room where it mattered. "I was fired in front of staff, thrown out without reference or pay. My reputation shattered with a single word." She paused. That word was hers. The silence was sharp now. "I rebuilt from that moment," she continued. "With no name, no support. The same kind of journey ST0L claims to champion." But today, when asked why she started her business, Eleanor couldn't find her voice. Not because she's incapable, but because she's never truly lived what she preaches. She leaned back, her expression soft but firm. "This board funds integrity, not reinvention for the sake of relevance. I'm not against second chances. I just know when someone hasn't earned one." Richard gave her a small nod. The rest of the board followed suit. There was no debate after that. The decision was clear. Eleanor sat upright when the assistant returned with a nod. "The board is ready to see you." She stood, smoothed her blazer again, and walked toward the door like a woman preparing for battle, but with none of the weapons she once relied on. Her confidence had cracked. Her charm had failed. Now, she walked in with nothing but her silence and her regret. The boardroom was still. 7 members sat at the long table. At the center, Richard Lawson, and beside him, Grace. Poised, radiant, untouched by Eleanor's storm. "Ms. Carrington," Richard began, voice even. "Thank you for your presentation. We've completed our deliberation." Before he could continue, Eleanor raised a hand. "Please, just before you make your final decision, I'd like to speak." Richard hesitated, then nodded. She stepped forward, voice softer than it had been in years. "What I did to you, Grace," she looked directly at her, "was wrong. I see that now. I accused you without cause. I humiliated you. I didn't even give you a voice." Grace said nothing. Eleanor continued. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I built ST0L because I realized I had become everything I once despised. I needed to become more than my past." A long pause followed. Then Richard leaned forward. You speak of becoming more than your past, he said. But here's the truth, Miss Carrington, we don't invest in words. We invest in people. Eleanor's expression flickered. Your pitch was clean. Your branding, polished. But when asked to explain your why, you looked lost, he added. He tapped the table gently, then nodded toward Grace. The woman you once dismissed built something from nothing, without a voice, without a platform, without your privilege. And yet, she never let bitterness define her. That's leadership. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but Richard closed the folder in front of him. Shivo will not be receiving investment from LPI Holdings. The room stayed silent. Eleanor didn't argue, didn't beg. She simply nodded. The same way Grace had, years ago, when she had been given no voice. But this time, the silence spoke volumes. Richard stood. Thank you for your time. She turned slowly and walked out, heels echoing across the marble floor, the sound of someone leaving, not just a room, but a story she no longer controlled. The automatic glass doors of the LPI building parted with a hiss, and Eleanor stepped out into the afternoon sun. But nothing felt warm. She walked slowly, the sharp tap of her heels on the concrete now sounding hollow, a rhythm out of sync with the confident woman she'd pretended to be just an hour ago. The city buzzed around her, indifferent. Cars passed. Phones rang. Strangers laughed. And yet, in Eleanor's world, everything had gone quiet. She reached the curb and stood there, unsure where to go. For the first time in her life, there was no next party, no next event, no next platform to chase. Just space. Empty, echoing, and unkind. Miss Carrington? The voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned. A young woman, no older than 22, stood nearby, clutching a tablet and wearing a lanyard with an intern badge. Her eyes were wide, curious, and a little unsure. I saw you go in earlier, she said. I watched your pitch on the live stream. It was really powerful. Did you get the deal? Eleanor paused. She looked at the girl, the enthusiasm in her eyes, the unshaken belief and ambition, the way she still thought the world played fair. A small, sad smile crossed Eleanor's lips. No, she said softly. I lost it years ago. The girl blinked. Sorry. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the street, then back to the building behind her. I lost the deal before I ever made the pitch. I just didn't know it at the time. The girl didn't understand, not fully, but she nodded politely. Eleanor gave her a small nod of goodbye and turned to walk away, her figure shrinking into the crowd. Her name now just another one whispered in conversations about what could have been. Behind her, on the top floor of the building, Grace stood beside Richard, watching through the window. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply placed her hand on her husband's arm and said, let's move forward. Because she had no desire to stay in the past, not even to revisit her victory. They say life is a circle, that the hands we push down on our way up are often the same ones we meet when the tables turn. Eleanor once believed she was untouchable. That power came from association, elegance, and perception. That silence could be commanded, and people discarded like shadows in a well-lit room. But what she didn't understand was this. Power built on pride has no foundation, and perception without truth eventually collapses. She had everything, until she used her voice to tear another woman down. And in doing so, she silenced herself in ways she never saw coming. Grace, on the other hand, had nothing. No title, no support, no defense. But what she did have was integrity. And when you carry that, even through humiliation, even through injustice, it follows you. It builds you. It introduces you to rooms where your past is no longer shameful, but sacred. Grace never sought revenge. She didn't return to destroy. She returned because she had risen, and her presence alone became the justice Eleanor never saw coming. In the end, Eleanor walked away with no deal, no applause, and no legacy. And Grace? She didn't just win. She rewrote the ending. Be careful who you falsely accuse when no one is watching. The powerless today may become the decision-makers tomorrow. And when truth returns, it doesn't knock. It walks in and takes a seat at the table. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Like to support powerful storytelling. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that every fall can be the start of a rise. Subscribe for more dramatic, truth-filled folktales that stay with you long after the screen fades. Because sometimes, the people we write off quietly Return to write the final chapter.